Hello again, 102. To conclude Lyndon Baines Johnson in domestic affairs in the United States, we'll talk about his idea of the Great Society. And Johnson interpreted his lopsided victory in the election in 1964 as a mandate for massive changes. And when he became president in November of '63, Social Security was America's only nationwide social program, and that soon changed. In 1965, Johnson began flooding Congress with waves of Great Society legislation that he said would end poverty, revitalize decaying cities, provide every person the chance to attend college, protect the health of the elderly, enhance the arts and humanities, clean up the nation's polluted air and water, and make the highways safer and prettier. The scope of Johnson's Great Society exceeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, in part because of the nation's extraordinary prosperity during the mid-1960s. This country, Johnson proclaimed, is rich enough to do anything it has the guts to do, and the vision to do, and the will to do. That proved not to be the case, however. And these are some huge pieces of Great Society legislation that made it through the Congress. Health insurance, housing, and higher education. For 20 years, the steadfast opposition of physicians making up the American Medical Association had stalled a comprehensive medical insurance program. Now that Johnson and the Democrats had the votes to pass the measure, however, the AMA joined Republicans in supporting a bill that served those over age 65. And the act that finally emerged went well beyond the original proposal. It created not just Medicare health insurance program for the elderly, but also a Medicaid program of federal grants to states to help cover the medical expenses for the poor. So indigent over 65 is covered by Medicaid. And Johnson signed the bill on July 30th, 1965 in Independence, Missouri, with 81-year-old Harry Truman looking on. As you'll recall, he had originally proposed this in the Fair Deal. The Higher Education Act of 1965 increased federal grants to universities, created scholarships for low-income students, provided low-interest loans for students, and established a national teacher corps. Every child, Johnson asserted, must be encouraged to get as much education as he has the ability to take. And again, this goes back to his life experiences as a teacher. The Immigration Act was legislation that abolished discriminatory quotas based upon immigrants' national origin and treated all nationalities and races equally. And during the 1960s and since, this really changed who new Americans are going to be. Over 60 million immigrants have come to America since 1965, and most of them now are natives of Latin America and Asia. And significant numbers of them join the armed forces, making the military much more diverse than ever. And sometimes this Immigration Act is forgotten about in some of the other Great Society programs that were enacted. Voting rights legislation, and this is the last big piece of the civil rights movement. Building upon the successes of Freedom Summer, Martin Luther King Jr. organized an effort in early 1965 to register the 3 million unregistered African American voters in the South. And in Selma, Alabama, where only 250 of 15,000 blacks of voting age were registered voters, hundreds of black and white civil rights protesters began a march to Montgomery, about 54 miles away, only to be assaulted by 500 state troopers using clubs, tear gas, and bullwhips. The news from Selma, reported the Washington Post, and we've already talked about this, will shock and alarm the whole nation. A federal judge agreed to allow the marches to continue, and President Johnson provided troops for their protection. Still, 2 white marchers, a mother of 5 from Detroit, and a Boston minister were murdered. By March 25th, when demonstrators reached Montgomery, some 25,000 people were with them, and Dr. King delivered a rousing address on the steps of the state capitol in which he said, "The battle is in our hands, and we can answer with creative nonviolence the call to higher ground, to which the new directions of our struggle summons us. Several days earlier, Johnson had urged Congress to overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice by making the cause of civil rights our cause too, and he then concluded by slowly speaking the words of the movement's hymn, "And we shall overcome." And the Voting Rights Act ensured that all Americans were able to vote by outlawing literacy tests, the poll tax, and grandfather clauses, and those other means that had been used to restrict voting rights of African Americans and other minorities in the United States. This is a huge landmark piece of legislation. And here's a nice picture of the signing with Dr. King to Johnson's right and other supporters of the measure. What to make now of this great society? As an accidental president following a tragic assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson sought to give Americans a sense of forward movement in troubled times and show them that he could overcome their fears of a divided America, and create a great society whereby people would be more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. Yet the Great Society and War on Poverty programs never lived up to Johnson's grandiose goals, in part because the Vietnam War soon took priority, as we'll see, and siphoned away funding, and in part because neither Johnson nor his congressional supporters understood the stubborn complexity of chronic culture of poverty. The Great Society, however, did include several triumphs for lower-income Americans. Infant mortality has dropped. College completion rates have soared. Malnutrition has virtually disappeared, and far fewer elderly Americans are living below the poverty line. The federal guarantee of civil rights and voting rights remains in place to this day. Medicare and Medicaid have become two of the most appreciated government programs. Consumers now have a federal agency protecting them, the Consumer Protection Agency. Head Start programs providing preschool enrichment activities for poor students have produced long-term benefits. The federal food stamp program has improved the nutrition and health of children living in poverty. Finally, the scholarships provided to low-income college students have been immensely valuable in enabling young people to gain access to higher education. Several of Johnson's most ambitious programs, however, were ill-conceived. Others were vastly underfunded, and many were mismanaged and even corrupt. Some of the problems they were meant to address actually worsened. As Joseph Califano, one of Johnson's senior aides, confessed, did we legislate too much? Were mistakes made? Plenty of them. Medicare, for example, removed incentives for hospitals to control costs, so medical bills skyrocketed for everyone. In addition, food stamp fraud soared as people took advantage of a program intended to ensure healthy nutrition. Overall, Great Society programs helped to reduce the percentage of the population living in poverty from 19% in 1964 to 10% in 1973, but it did so largely by providing federal welfare payments, not finding people decent jobs. And by 1966, middle-class resentment over the cost and excesses of Great Society programs and the culture of welfare generated a conservative backlash that fueled a Republican resurgence in Congress. By then, however, the Great Society had transformed public expectation of power and the role of the federal government. And that is what we continue to debate today, ladies and gentlemen. Since the last 50 years, these debates have gone on. And that concludes this Great Society and all these measures intended to improve the lives of American citizens.